Six. Hi, I'm Ville Pelkonen. It's very nice to see you here, and I'm glad you came. So, yes. So today I'm going to talk about React Native. I come from a web developer background. I did front-end for a couple of years, or a few years. But when I started at Qvik, I started doing React Native, which was about two years ago, a few months, give or take. And with that background and experience, I'd like to maybe show you my world. I know you guys are iOS developers, probably doing Swift, Objective-C, coming from the purely native side. But nevertheless, I'd like to bridge the gap between you guys and us, React and web development guys, because I think we can share a lot of common ground these days through React Native and in other means. And how I'd like to do this is to you can imagine yourself a project, something that you're starting to do, or maybe continuing on. And let's see, like I have tried to reverse engineer the decision making in when to choose your technology, or how to choose your technology regarding that specific project, and when to use React Native. Also when not to use it. So what is React Native? You build native mobile apps using JavaScript and React, and basically everything that React Native blurts out is fully native, even though you write it in JavaScript. The projects I've made, maybe 99.x% of the code has been written in JavaScript. That's pretty fancy. Of course, JavaScript might not be the favorite programming language for everyone, but it is for a lot of people out there. And this means that a lot of people now have access to making native mobile apps, which are pretty sleek, pretty powerful, in some strange cases, even more performant than fully native apps. So this is an exciting time for those people like me, and possibly also for you. But the React Native promise and the React promise itself is learn once, write anywhere. And that's the power of React Native. That's the power of React, actually. You can write it once in one way at the front end, and then you can ship it in whatever platform you wish for. You can make, well, the typical case was for React Native 2014 or 15, when it started to try making iOS apps with JavaScript. These days, it's also extended very heavily on Android, so iOS, Android, that's the typical use case for making React Native app. But you can also ship it to make, just use the same React code to make web frontend. You can make Linux desktop apps. You can make Windows apps. Rare cases, but they're still possible. And there are a lot of people working in the community, working towards making React accessible for any major platform there is. These are some of the apps that use React Native. They ship with React Native. It doesn't mean that they're built only with React Native. React Native is just a library. It's included to enable a JavaScript interpreter and like draw your UI. So basically, for example, Messenger, Discord might actually be mainly React Native. But Facebook, Messenger, a lot of these things just use React Native for some parts of their app. Still very impactful. I couldn't find any iOS data because Apple is pretty selfish about giving all their data to people. But on Android, the top 500 apps in Google Play Store, I think it was React Native was in more than 13% of those apps, and one of the highest ones. So React Native is really used out in the world these days, even after just a few years. So now you have a new project coming, and it might be any kind of service. How do I choose the right tech? I'm going to ask some questions, or like hypothetically, and give also some answers. I hope you like them. If you don't, please tell me afterwards in the question session. But this is more or less the decision path I use for whenever consulting for our clients or my colleagues, or I think it's pretty largely used. So your options are doing, and of course, talking about web frontend, like frontend itself. So having a UI of some sort so that customers, whether they be companies or your average Joes and Janes, they can use it also without a command line too. So the options are web, hybrid, cross-platform, native. I couldn't come up with anything else. Basically, these are your options, what you can do. You can do a web front end, use it in the browser. Very common, very typical. Hybrid means basically using Ionic, Cordova, or something that you wrap a web implementation in a native wrapper, typically using WebView. In iOS, it's WK WebView. I think these days used to be UI WebView. Anyway, that's also a commonly used way of shipping apps. Then there's cross-platform, which React Native is. So you write something in something completely different, and then it just ships whatever you have in that native technology itself. And then there's a pure native, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. So you just write in Java, Kotlin, Swift, Objective-C, whatever you use. This is the case basically on all these latter three ship native apps. They go to App Store, Google Play Store, I don't know, sometimes Amazon Store or something. In contrast to you doing a web where you just ship it as like a URL or you have a domain and stuff. Very different cases, but for this exercise, let's see what the differences are. What are the benefits of doing web and native? Because that's always not entirely clear. I'm going to do the quick comparison just because I can show you what React can bring to the native world. So as you see, why choose native over web? The native apps are much more powerful in so many ways. So they're so much better connected to the hardware because the developers of the machines, the devices, whatever we use, also support the platforms. So, of course, you download it once, you use a Play Store, App Store, something. They're very trusted by users. You get better retention. People come back to those apps because you can just save them in your home, like a home screen, right? You get a very premium look and feel. It's fast. It's nice. You get animations compared to, for example, web front end. Very different. And you can also use them offline, what rarely you can do with websites. Of course, progressive web apps are here. iOS starts to support them as well. So that can also bridge the gap a little bit. So the web is taking over little by little. I'm not saying it will take over, probably not. I don't really believe that, even though some do. But I wouldn't be worried. But the web also has the largest market. They're not limited to Play or App Stores or anything. So that's why typically you make a website or a web service instead of native apps. However, with React, you get some benefits which you don't otherwise get. You only use React and JavaScript, or your choice of TypeScript, for example. So you get typed JavaScript, which is easier to scale. You get a lot of tooling options. It might be a double-edged sword. So you get a lot of external third-party tools to do stuff with your code. Then again, you get a lot more dependencies, which the native side is much better at. Using React Native, you can get a really fast development cycle. What React Native basically does is eats your JavaScript and does native based on that. So basically, whatever you give it at any given moment, you can basically hot load code into the app itself, and it shows you what it actually would render, what it actually would do when you run that code real time. Very efficient. You can also get a faster release cycle. Because of this, you can just ship your JavaScript over a server to your app, so you can ignore Apple and Google completely if you're brave enough. Basically, you don't need to go through app review. That's pretty nice. But, of course, just don't tell Apple that you're doing it too much. So these are some things that you get from using React Native for making native apps. Okay, for the sake of this exercise, let's say we're making a native app. I won't go to the web stuff so much. What are the actual case-to-case benefits? So native has still pretty much an edge. You get a very mature platform, which React is not. Contrary to what people say, React is getting mature for sure. but it's not quite there, especially React Native. For fully native apps, you get slightly more premium feel. You get the animations, everything just the way you want it, just right. You don't have to stress about them not working, what you need to do sometimes with React Native. You can use strictly typed languages. I'm guessing most of you use Swift, right? You get better APIs right as they're released. You get an annual core update schedule, so React Native is updated every month. You'll have to update your libraries at least once a quarter. So that's a lot of maintenance if you want to upkeep your app. Native, Apple and Google typically have better documentation compared to React Native. React Native's documentation is not optimal. I'll get back to that later, but it can be difficult to traverse for sure. You also get a smaller app bundle size, but in today's rates, that's not much if you ship a 15 megabyte app compared to an 18 one. However, for React Native, the main benefit and the main reasons people use React Native is that you only write the code once and then you ship it to Android and iOS. That's a typical case. So as you need to only write it once, you have less time and money. You need less time and money to ship it out. Especially, this is really good for especially fast projects, prototype projects, things you have to finish in a couple months. You can just write it and then it's out. If you don't need to upkeep it, if you don't need to update it, that's fine. As long as it works, it will work. React Native won't break by itself, by definition. If you are an expert in web stuff, you know React already, so you get to do the same stuff with native apps again. So that's very nice. That was really cool for me, actually, starting with React Native. Hey, I can do native apps. Hey, look at me, mom. Which was really, really powerful because the native world was so hard to approach for me. Now, of course, I've learned to battle Xcode and Apple and Google and everything. But that's something that React Native developers will have to do at some point anyway. You get a faster development cycle. As I mentioned, React Native eats your JavaScript, does your native stuff real time. Really good for development. You just change your code a little bit and it shows you how it would work. Not like simulated. It is actually what it is. And you can push those stuff beside Apple, which is nice. This is a lot of stuff, by the way, so I'll be having questions also because you might have some. So based on those facts, based on those observations, when can we use React Native? When should we use React Native? You have to look at your team first. I would say your team is actually more important than the project in this. But your project also has to be a good match. If it doesn't, then you're probably going to have a bad time trying it out. So if you want to make an app just for iOS, sure, you can do React Native, especially if you already know React and JavaScript, but it's probably going to be more efficient for projects where you ship for both Android and iOS. Obviously, because you don't really need to tweak it unless you want to. If you want to make a, let's say, Apple Watch app with React Native, you can't. You don't want much differences between the iOS and Android apps. You're not too married to the idea of doing your Apple design guidelines or by material design by Google. If your app is massive or it's going to last for forever, then React Native might be a bit difficult because you'll have to keep updating it every couple months at least. If you're ready for that, that's great. But be sure that your teams, if you have multiple, they get to synergize their work. They get the API access a bit later because the Facebook's React and React Native team have to be able to react to Apple's and Google's new additions and the hardware. Complex gestures are a bit difficult sometimes. If you're making a full refactor of an existing native app, let's say this is what Airbnb tried a little bit, so they took React Native into their app and hey, let's say if we can do this pretty easily, it's easy to update and maintain. And then they did, and then they realized they got more than they bargained for. Airbnb's app only had 4% of the UI was done with React Native, so it was more like a stone in their ankle chained to it. So that's something that you might want to avoid. But if you are making parts to an existing native app, you need to be able to commit. This means that your team, which is making the Android and iOS app, needs to commit also to React Native. So commitment is key. If your team has no experience with JavaScript and React, that's fine. You'll just have to learn it. Obviously, you can't do the tech without knowing the language and the tools and the ecosystem, which is a mess for JavaScript, for sure. And I think, most importantly, if your team is not interested, if you are not interested in React Native, please try it out. Try it out by yourself in a personal project or some side project, which takes a few days or something. Maybe to evaluate it deeply, put in a couple of weeks. And it's going to be hard at the start, but don't go there without trying the water first. So React Native, if you don't have experience in JavaScript and React, the React ecosystem, as I said, is a mess, and it might be a bit of a deep dive if you just jump right in. So make sure you know what you're doing. Try it out. Prototype first. You'll need a few weeks or months to spend on learning. It doesn't mean that you can't ship within that time. Yes, you can. You can ship in the first week you start doing because it's really, really fast. But doing the very scalable, highly maintained apps for years and years, it's going to take some experience. So in short, you could choose React Native if you're making an iOS and Android mobile app that isn't massive or natively cutting edge, so you don't have all the newest and newest, and you have to have a team with drive to use React. If this is a match for you, which I think for a lot of projects actually is, then go ahead. I think you're probably going to have a good time. If you're replacing an existing hybrid app using Ionic, Cordova, or something like that, you're probably already stuck with the problems, and React Native is, of course, just better, so feel free to refactor one of those or recreate. So, just a few more minutes. So, what? React Native is not even the first release yet. No, it is not. It hasn't been, and it's still used by the top companies in the world, so what gives? Facebook has promised just this summer that they want to make a larger refactoring of React Native itself. They're focusing on uniting Facebook's internal way of using React Native, which they claim is quite different from the open source API usage, which sounds weird to us especially, but they have acknowledged it as a problem because they have shipped breaking changes which they didn't know would be breaking changes for the public. So they try to get their height together and make it better for us as well. And they promise to share their internal tools they use for React Native, so really excited to look what that looks like. They're going to remove a lot of stuff within React Native and make it like third-party libraries, which are maintained by them itself and also the community, which is really strong. So React Native is lighter and going to be easier to use. If you don't need a web view, for example, you might need to have it as a third-party library. But they'll be maintaining those as well. Improved support for CocoaPods, Xcode, build systems, and the new build system, Gradle, and all Android stuff. So making it easier to adapt into the native workflow. Their documentation sucks. They have acknowledged it. They want to make it better. I hope they will, or I'm going to figuratively punch them. And they have also promised to improve communication with the community, since the community has gone so strong these days. So they want to actually serve us as we serve them by using their technology. This, they have said that should and will happen during this and the next year. So let's see how long that takes. Currently, React Native is a bit difficult because the update cycle is a bit fluctuating. but there's good stuff coming. So, yes. I hope you got some kind of a view into React Native from your perspective. I'll be happy to have some questions if you have any. I'm sure you have. And I'll be here now to answer them, or if I don't have the time if there are a lot of questions, come talk to me after this. So that'd be great.
All right, so
thank you.
Yeah. So do we have any questions for Ville in the audience? Please raise your hand and I'll give you the mic.
Hi, thank you very much. If you have an Android app, an iOS app, and parts of these apps are React Native, and you, for instance, need to have a uniform domain model or appearance that looks the same, say, for instance, you have a primary button that is pink with a corner radius of sorts. Yep. You have that both in React Native and iOS and Android. Is there some way to keep those properties in one place, or do you have to duplicate the code?
So if I understood right, you want to make a button both in all three platforms the same, so Android, iOS, done natively, and also React Native. Personally, I have not come to that case yet. Possibly Jonas has, because he's talking about yoga. Maybe he has some ideas. Pushing the responsibility. I'm not sure. I'll have to be honest.
Any more questions?
Thanks. So if you, let's say Facebook fixes all those problems that they promised to fix within 2 years, let's just say that happens, you still have the problem that the apps that come out of React Native don't look platform native, right? They don't look like the platform that they're supposed to be on. But if the controls that pop out of React Native when it compiles or whatever it does, why can't they look native? Is there a way to get them to be more specific per platform that they're on if you put more work into it? Or do most people just sort of end and go like, well, they look the same, it's fine?
That's an excellent question. The community tries to make tools that imitate as much as possible the native look and feel, especially for some tools. However, it's difficult. Facebook has said that they specifically want to make the native UI libraries closer, so possibly the navigation and everything, all the animations, all the a user experience should be taken. They have said that they'll make it closer and easier to use, but that's just their promise. So you just have their word on it. Yeah, I'll be also a little contrarian and ask: is it so important to make it? For iOS, I understand Apple is very strict about it, and the Apple ecosystem is very good because it's so curated, maintained. So, yes.
Hey, thanks for the beautiful talk. You stressed it several times that you can kind of get it past Apple. What does that actually mean? Have you had some bad experiences with Apple? Has Apple pushed away anything you've tried to ship? Because I know Apple has very strict guidelines about you shipping ever-shifting apps that they can't control. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there. Can you tell us a bit more about it, please?
Of course. Good question. I have experience also. There's a tool which was made by a competitor called Microsoft. And they made this tool called Code Push, which basically does that. They host their own dedicated or shared server where you can push IDs. The whole tool takes care of it. So you just have this snapshot of your JavaScript, and if you want to update it for all of your apps across the I don't know, this country or those users or this A/B testing or the whole world, then you just push that JavaScript, and then it goes through Microsoft servers into the apps, as long as your app has that SDK enabled as well. And of course, Apple can't take control of this because it's JavaScript. They can only say that, hey, you're using Code Push SDK, so we're not approving this. This, as far as I know, has not happened in a larger scale yet. It might happen sometime because Apple probably, of course, wants to control their reviews. So far, I don't think it has been a problem that people are pushing material and content for apps that is like strictly against Apple's guidelines. The usefulness of this service is to make hot fixes easy and stress-free. So it might be that Apple throws a hammer at it at some point, but if you don't use it, that's okay. If you use it, then don't rely on it too much.
All right, thank you very much once again, Ville. And if anybody has any more questions, I'm sure they can find you in the break. All right, thank you, Ville.
Thank you.